Imagine standing in a trench, soaked in mud, waiting for the whistle that tells you to run headfirst into machine gun fire. You've got rats chewing on corpses beside you, clouds of chlorine gas rolling in, and somewhere overhead, a pilot's tossing grenades out of his cockpit like it's a bar fight. This is the World 1 Iceberg, and what you just heard is only the beginning. Tier 1. Sack of Dinant. People say World War I started with a teenage assassin and a gun, but the truth is it came from old grudges and leaders who couldn't back down. And within weeks of it kicking off, Belgium saw one of its first massacres. On August 23, 1914, German troops stormed into Dinant and lined up 137 civilians against the garden wall. They opened fire, and when the smoke cleared, the bodies were stacked in a street. A few people survived by lying still until dark, but some of them were caught again and killed anyway. By the end of that day, 674 civilians were dead. Most of the victims were men, but there were women and children too. The official story was that locals had been shooting at German troops, but weeks earlier, the mayor had already ordered everyone to hand in their weapons, and no guns were ever found. What really fueled it was frustration. German forces had just taken heavy losses in a nearby valley, where echoing gunfire made them think they were surrounded. And by the time they came back to Dinant, every civilian looked like an enemy. The killing spread fast. Families were dragged out of their homes, monks were shot in the square, whole neighborhoods went up in flames, and soldiers raided wine cellars as they went. They even forced civilians to march in front of them as human shields. One infant, just 3 weeks old, was among the dead. German commanders called it retaliation. Some of them stuck to that for years, while others eventually admitted there hadn't been any resistance at all. It was just rage, panic, and the need to make an example out of someone. In 2001, Germany finally apologized, but by then the survivors were gone, and the victims were just names on memorials, and a garden wall that still stands as proof of what happens when an army decides to take its anger out on civilians. Sadly, this wasn't the last time civilians paid for someone else's war crimes. There's an entry in Tier 3 where an entire town hall was turned into a warning. But first, let me show you the most peaceful day in the entire war. Christmas Truce. For one strange Christmas in 1914, the Western Front stopped being a slaughterhouse and briefly turned into a block party. British and German soldiers put down their rifles, crawled out of their trenches, and met in no man's land. They shook hands, swapped cigarettes, sang carols, and even played a football match that nobody kept score of. Then, when the holidays were over, they went right back to shooting each other. The whole thing wasn't ordered, or even planned. It just started with Germans singing Stille Nacht, and the British shouting carols back like drunk neighbors across a fence. By morning, men were climbing over the sandbags, recovering frozen corpses together, trading chocolate for buttons, and taking group photos like tourists. The generals hated it because, well, their men were fraternizing with the enemy. The moment letters home started describing this cozy ceasefire, newspapers turned it into a feel-good story, which only made commanders angrier. The following year, they made sure it wouldn't happen again by timing artillery barrages to ruin the festive mood before anyone could try singing. And despite the romantic retelling, the truce wasn't universal. French and Belgian troops, whose towns were literally being flattened, didn't exactly feel festive. Even for the British and Germans, the truce only lasted a couple of days before new units rolled in and business returned to normal, meaning mud, rats, and machine guns. Still, the memory struck. Some veterans later said it was surreal to be laughing with men they'd been ordered to kill the next week. For a few, it made the whole war harder to justify. The Christmas truce didn't end the fighting. It just proved that the war could have ended if the people actually fighting it were the ones in charge. And then history buried that idea under 4 more years of barbed wire, chlorine gas, and mass graves. This was one of the rare feel-good moments in the war, but don't get used to it, because there's a burial coming up in Tier 5 that's way worse than anything you'd find in a graveyard. First though, let's talk about a group of soldiers who thought they saw angels. Angels of Mons, 1914. The Battle of Mons was Britain's first real scrap in World War I, and it went about as well as you'd expect when a tiny expeditionary force runs face first into the German army. Outnumbered and outgunned, the British basically had to sprint back across Belgium. Strangely, what made headlines wasn't the retreat. It was the part where people said angels showed up. It all started with Arthur Machen, a writer who thought it'd be fun to publish a little ghost story called The Bowmen. In it, tired British soldiers called out to St. George, and suddenly a bunch of medieval archers rise from the grave to take down the Germans. Machen had made the whole thing up, but the paper forgot to mention that part, and so plenty of readers assumed it was true. From there, it spiraled. Priests started preaching about it in church. Spiritualist magazines ran testimonies, and the angels kept getting upgraded. First it was ghost bowmen, then shining figures with flaming swords, then Joan of Arc floating over the battlefield. Some people even claimed German bodies had arrow wounds, even though none of these so-called witnesses had been anywhere near Mons. Machen tried to explain that he made it up, which only made people double down. If he said it was fake, then clearly he was hiding something. Newspapers kept printing miracle stories because they sold, and clergy leaned on them because it was easier than describing the mud and blood of trench life. At that point, even the government may have gotten involved. Some historians believe British intelligence quietly let the myth spread. Morale was collapsing, desertion was rising, and soldiers might think twice about running if they believed the Archangel Michael was on their side. Eventually, the Society for Psychical Research, a group that takes ghosts way too seriously, decided to investigate. They didn't find a single solid witness or document, just rumors, recycled letters, and testimonies from people who weren't anywhere near the front. Which made sense because the only spirit soldiers saw during the war were gin rations. So no, angels didn't save the British army, a short story did. And for a while, that was apparently good enough. Souain Corporals Affair. On March 17, 1915, 4 French corporals were executed by their own army. They hadn't deserted, betrayed anyone, or switched sides. What they did was refuse to charge straight into machine gun fire after already being shelled by their own artillery. That spring, French generals were desperate for progress in the Champagne region. Every attack had ended in disaster, but instead of changing tactics, they just ordered another bayonet charge near the village of Souain. The 21st Company was told to go over the top at 5 a.m., and then, just before the signal, French artillery shelled the wrong trenches. Dozens of their own men were killed or mangled, and the survivors were still told to get up and run into German guns. Some tried and were gunned down immediately. The rest stayed put, because they weren't insane. General Giraud Revolt didn't care. He even tried to order another round of artillery on his own soldiers to motivate them. But the artillery commander refused unless it was written down. The order never came, but Revolt still wanted someone punished. So Captain Eckelbey was told to pick men at random. 18 privates and 6 corporals were chosen. After some back and forth, most were spared. But 4 corporals, Théophile Maupas, Lucien Lechat, Louis Leffelon, and Louis Girard, weren't so lucky. The court-martial was basically a rubber stamp. By morning, the 4 were lined up and shot in front of their regiment. 2 hours later, someone quietly reduced their sentences to forced labor, except they were already dead, which kind of ruined the gesture. One of the widows, Blanche Maupas, refused to let the story die. For nearly 20 years, she wrote letters, rallied protests, and dragged the case back into the public eye until the government had to deal with it. In 1934, a special court cleared all 4 corporals. The families got 1 symbolic franc in damages, which wasn't much, but at least history finally admitted the obvious. The assault was pointless, the order was impossible, and 4 men had been killed for nothing. Tier 2. Sinking of RMS Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, and the ship went down in just 18 minutes. Out of the 1,960 people on board, 1,197 died. The majority were civilians. Over 100 were children. And sadly, babies were in the count too. The Lusitania was a British ocean liner run by the Cunard Line. It had left New York 6 days earlier, heading for Liverpool. Everyone said it was fast, sleek, and supposedly unarmed. Officially, it was a passenger ship. Unofficially, it had over 4 million rounds of rifle ammo and artillery shells stuffed into the cargo hold. That little detail will matter a lot in a minute. See, Germany had already made it clear that any Allied ships in the war zone were fair game, even if they had passengers on board. They even ran newspaper ads in the US, warning people not to sail on Allied ships, right next to the Lusitania's departure info. But most folks just shrugged it off. The British said it was a bluff, and people believed them. It wasn't. The German U-boat U-20 fired 1 torpedo. Just 1, but that was all it needed. The hit triggered a massive second explosion. Historians still debate if it was from the munitions or the boilers, and the ship sank before most of the lifeboats could even hit the water. People were crushed, trapped, or thrown overboard. Some drowned inside the ship while others froze in the icy water, waiting for rescue crews that took too long. Entire families were wiped out in the attack. When the news broke, the British government didn't waste a second. They painted the whole thing as a deliberate massacre of innocent civilians. Of course, they made sure not to mention the ammo below deck or the fact that the ship had also been registered as an auxiliary warship. The actual cargo manifest, which is the official list of everything on board, wasn't fully released until decades later. Germany defended the attack, saying the ship was a legitimate military target, and technically, they weren't wrong. But technically doesn't help much when you've just torpedoed a ship full of tourists and 128 dead Americans. That part definitely nudged the US closer to joining the war. If you think torpedoes were brutal, wait till you get to Tier 6. There's an entry where entire cities starved and it wasn't by accident. In the meantime, let's talk about a fortress full of men who just wouldn't die. The attack of the dead men. In August 1915, at Souain Fortress, in what's now Poland, the Germans launched a gas attack they were sure would wipe out everything inside. They'd pumped in a thick cloud of chlorine and bromine gas, and they waited for silence. Inside, Russian troops were choking to death. Their lungs were filling with blood, their skin was burning off, and anyone still breathing was coughing up chunks of their insides. So when the gas cleared, German infantry began marching in, expecting nothing but corpses. And they got them, sort of. Because out of that fog came what looked like the dead. Their uniforms were shredded, their faces wrapped in blood-soaked rags, and many had chemical burns so severe they barely looked human. Some were half blind, others were literally holding in their insides. But through it all, they weren't retreating or begging for mercy. Instead, they were charging forward with rifles in hand. The surviving Russians were barely alive, but they were still moving and fighting. The Germans panicked. They hadn't planned for this. These weren't fresh reinforcements. They were the same men who'd just been gassed, and yet they kept advancing. German troops turned and ran, and in the chaos, some tripped over their own barbed wire, while others ran straight into their own artillery fire. The Russians weren't trying to win the war that day. They just weren't ready to die lying down. The Germans eventually took Souain anyway, because yes, more gas and heavier artillery finally overwhelmed the defenders, but not before suffering the embarrassment of fleeing from the men they had already declared dead. The story didn't become famous right away. It didn't fit into any of the war's neat propaganda narratives, but for those who saw it, it stuck. One side brought poison and science. The other brought spite, adrenaline, and the indomitable human spirit that keeps fighting even with melting lungs. And somehow, that was enough to turn the tide for a day. That's why they still call it the Attack of the Dead Men. Execution of Edith Cavell. In October 1915, a British nurse named Edith Cavell was executed by a German firing squad in Brussels. She was 49 years old, and her crime was helping around 200 Allied soldiers escape German-occupied Belgium. To the Germans, she was a traitor. To the British, she became a martyr. To Cavell herself, it was just the right thing to do. Before the war, she'd been running a nursing school in Brussels. When the Germans rolled in, she stayed. Her job was to treat the wounded, German or Allied. But behind the scenes, she was helping a resistance network smuggle British and French troops out through the Netherlands. When she was caught, she didn't deny it. She confessed in court, laid out everything she'd done, and in doing so, sealed her fate. Under German military law, that confession meant death. She was shot at dawn on October 12, 1915, along with another resistance member, Philippe Bock. The world didn't take it well. Even neutral countries like the United States, which hadn't joined the war yet, condemned the execution. To save face, the German authorities framed it as a straightforward case. They said they'd lawfully executed a spy. Technically, they weren't wrong. Helping enemy soldiers escape is a capital offense during wartime. But shooting a civilian nurse who healed soldiers on both sides? That wasn't a good look for them, and they knew it. Back in Britain, Cavell's face was plastered everywhere. On posters and newspapers, even in recruitment drives. She wasn't trying to be a symbol, though. The night before her execution, she told the priest, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness for anyone." Those final words became rallying cries across the country. After the war, Cavell's body was returned to Britain, and she was buried with full honors. Edith Cavell's execution caused significant problems for the Germans. But in Tier 6, there's an entry where soldiers got so fed up that they stopped playing along entirely. Russian pogroms during World War I. The Russian pogroms during World War I don't get much attention, and that's probably because mass violence against minorities wasn't exactly new in the Russian Empire. But this time, it wasn't just angry villagers with pitchforks and torches. This time, it was the state. In 1914, Russia joined the war and immediately became paranoid. The government started seeing spies everywhere, especially among Jews and ethnic Germans. The logic was simple. If you spoke German or prayed in Hebrew, you were probably working for the enemy. So the army and police treated entire communities like security threats. People were beaten in the streets, shops were looted, entire neighborhoods were flattened, and nobody in charge was trying to stop it. In fact, they were often leading the way. In March 1915, Russian troops captured the city of Przemyśl from Austria-Hungary after a long, brutal siege. As a reward, Tsarist soldiers decided to celebrate by unleashing violence on the local Jewish population. It wasn't just a few broken windows. It was a full-blown massacre. Homes were ransacked. People were dragged out and beaten. Killings became routine. Just 3 months later, on June 11, 1915, another wave of violence hit Petrograd. Only this time, the targets were ethnic Germans. Mobs destroyed over 500 German-owned shops, offices, and factories. And the police? They barely even showed up. Some reports even suggest that they participated. Then came the deportations. During the Great Retreat of 1915, as Russian forces lost ground to Germany and Austria-Hungary, military leaders needed someone to blame. So Chief of Staff Nikolai Yanushkevich, with support from Grand Duke Nicholas, ordered a scorched earth campaign along the empire's western borders. Villages were torched, and civilians, mostly Jews and Germans, were forcibly removed from their homes. Tens of thousands were sent east, deep into the Russian interior. And by interior, they mostly meant Siberia. There was no food, no shelter, and no real plan. Many didn't survive the journey. Those who did often died shortly after arriving. And as bad as that was, things only got worse during the Russian Civil War. After the revolution, the empire fractured, and the countryside turned into a free-for-all. Between 50,000 and 250,000 Jews were killed in pogroms across the region. Many of the attacks were carried out by organized military units and local warlords, and they resulted in entire Jewish villages being wiped off the map. Most of this took place in what is now Ukraine, and while the official story was still about security, modern historians call it what it really was: ethnic cleansing, which is a sanitized way of saying the Russian state, and later its rivals, systematically persecuted minorities for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sadly, this wasn't the only mass displacement. There's an entry in Tier 4 where people were marched into the desert and left to disappear. Tier 3. Bapaume Town Hall Explosion. On March 25, 1917, a time bomb left behind by retreating German forces exploded inside the town hall of Bapaume, France, killing 24 people. Most were Australian soldiers, 2 were French parliamentarians, and a few were civilian volunteers serving coffee. None of them were in uniform when the building went up. Earlier that month, German troops had pulled back to the Hindenburg Line as part of Operation Albrecht, a scorched earth retreat designed to give up territory but leave nothing behind. Before pulling back, the troops destroyed roads, railways, rigged wells, mined basements, and booby-trapped everything from door handles to church pews. Bapaume had been under German control since 1914, and when they finally left, Allied troops moved in. The town was mostly rubble, but somehow the town hall was still standing. That alone raised red flags. The Australians did a sweep and even removed one bomb from the cellar, so they assumed the place was safe. They turned it into a rest stop, with the Australian Comforts Fund running a canteen where soldiers could grab tea, cake, and a letter from home. That night, 2 French deputies, Albert Taillandier and Raoul Briquet, also stopped by. Taillandier was the local member of the parliament, and this was his first visit since the Germans left. At exactly 11:30 p.m., a hidden charge detonated inside the town hall's tower. It was roughly 100 pounds of explosives, triggered by an acid delay fuse buried deep inside the structure. The blast ripped through the building, collapsed the tower, and crushed the ground floor. Everyone on that level died instantly, all 24 of them. Only 6 soldiers who'd been sleeping in the cellar made it out alive, and even then they had to be dug out the next morning. Just 1 day later, another hidden charge exploded on the outskirts of town, killing 2 more Australians. By then, it was clear the retreat hadn't been because the rival army had gotten sloppy. It had been methodically planned. Later, a captured German radio operator confirmed that several timed charges had been planted before the withdrawal. The town hall was eventually rebuilt, and today there's a plaque on the wall with the names of everyone who was killed that night. Soon you'll hear about the part of World War I where just taking a breath could burn you from the inside. But first, let's talk about the kind of wounds no bandage was ever going to fix. Shell shock recognition. World War I didn't just break bodies, it broke minds too. The men who came back shaking, stammering, and hollow-eyed weren't injured in the traditional sense. There were no bullets lodged in bone and no shrapnel to dig out, but they were shattered all the same. The term doctors used was shell shock. The symptoms were all over the place. Some men screamed in their sleep, while others couldn't speak at all. Their hands trembled, their faces twitched, and one moment they'd be pacing silently. The next, they'd be curled up in a fetal position under a hospital cot. A few wandered the trenches in circles, mumbling nonsense. Some couldn't stop shaking, couldn't eat, and couldn't even remember their own names. At first, people thought it was physical. The theory was that blast pressure from artillery had somehow damaged the brains of these men, hence the term shell shock. But doctors eventually noticed something odd. Some of the worst cases hadn't even been near an explosion, so the explanation shifted. They decided it was psychological, a full-body collapse caused by fear, trauma, exhaustion, and horror boiling over all at once. And since medicine in 1915 didn't have much room for nuance, any soldier who couldn't march in a straight line or fire his weapon was branded a coward or something worse. There wasn't much interest in understanding what the men were actually going through. Instead, treatment meant electroshock, isolation, forced exercise, or just yelling at him until he snapped out of it. The point wasn't to help them heal. It was to make them functional again. If a man could hold a rifle, he was considered cured. If not, he was left to rot. By the end of the war, about 80,000 to 200,000 British soldiers had been diagnosed with shell shock. And that's just one army. Many more were misdiagnosed or never reported at all. Some were even executed for desertion or cowardice when what they really needed was help. Today, we call it PTSD, but that label doesn't make it easier. These men watched their friends get ripped apart by explosions, crawled through mud soaked in blood, and breathed in the stench of burning flesh. And somehow, they came back. Facial disfigurement and prosthetics. Trench warfare didn't just kill people, it wrecked them. Shrapnel carved through jaws, bullets shattered cheekbones, and explosions peeled off faces like bark from a tree. Helmets were fine for the top of the head, but the face, that was still fair game. So a lot of soldiers came back looking nothing like themselves, if they came back at all. These weren't the kind of injuries you could cover up with a bandage and a stiff upper lip. Some men lost noses, others had their mouths torn away, and a few more were left standing with nothing below the eyes. Eating turned into an ordeal. So did breathing and talking. That's when hospitals stepped in, or at least tried to. Surgeons attempted to rebuild what had been blown off, but plastic surgery was barely a thing back then. Most of the early operations didn't go well, and successful usually meant not actively infected. So instead of fixing the faces, they started faking them. Anna Coleman Ladd was a sculptor from the US who used to make fountains and classical statues. But in 1917, she ended up in France making something way more personal: replacement faces. She set up a studio with the American Red Cross, and when a soldier came in missing half his head, she got to work. She'd start by taking a plaster cast of what was left, then sculpt a new face out of clay. After that, she'd hammer thin copper sheets into shape, paint them to match the guy's skin tone, and attach eyebrows or mustaches made from actual human hair. These weren't Halloween masks, they were wearable illusions. Some were even detailed enough to let the wearer smoke without taking them off. They were strapped on with string or glasses or glue. They weren't comfortable and they didn't move, but they gave men just enough cover to go outside without getting stared at. The French had a name for them: gueules cassées, or broken faces, and that's what they were. These men were walking reminders of what modern war actually did. Ladd wasn't the only one doing this. Francis Derwent Wood ran a similar shop in London, which people eventually called the Tin Noses Shop. Between them, they laid the groundwork for what would later become anaplastology, the field that now gives us silicone prosthetics and high-tech facial implants. But back then, it was just copper, paint, and a quiet determination to help someone feel human again. Mustard gas use at Ypres. Ypres was already hell before mustard gas showed up. The town had been shelled into rubble, and by the time the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, kicked off in 1917, around 500,000 men had been killed or wounded in the region. The trenches were flooded, the rats were eating corpses, and morale was basically non-existent. And then the Germans decided to make it worse. They rolled out sulfur mustard, also called Yperite, named after Ypres, where it made its big debut. It wasn't the first chemical weapon of the war, but it was easily one of the nastiest. Chlorine and phosgene might choke you out fast, but mustard gas was built for slow, painful, drawn-out suffering. You could walk through a cloud of it without even realizing. It didn't have that sharp, choking smell like chlorine, so you just keep moving like nothing was wrong, until about 6 hours later when your skin started to blister. Your eyes would swell shut, and welts would spread across your body. The gas soaked into fabric, boots, and blankets. If you sat in it, it burned straight through your underwear. If you breathed it in, it cooked your lungs from the inside. And it didn't go away. Mustard gas clung to the soil, and not even rain could wash it out. You could gas a trench, leave, and come back 3 days later to find it still just as deadly. It turned parts of the battlefield into long-term chemical traps. The worst part is, it isn't really all that effective. Only about 2% of mustard gas victims actually died, but it still injured over 120,000 Allied troops. That was the point. It wasn't meant to kill fast. It was meant to blind, burn, scar, and send soldiers home permanently broken. By the end of the war, mustard gas was everywhere. Every side had stockpiles, and no one really hesitated to use them. It wasn't until the Geneva Protocol in 1925 that countries finally agreed it was maybe a bit too cruel, at least on paper. Tier 4. Use of pigeons for communication. By 1918, people had already built machines that could erase entire battalions in an afternoon. Yet for battlefield communication, they were still relying on pigeons. Yes, actual birds, flapping through artillery fire with scraps of paper tied to their legs. And somehow that was considered a solid plan. The most famous of them was Cher Ami, which means dear friend in French. Despite the name, he was a British pigeon working for the American Army during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. On October 4, 1918, hundreds of US soldiers ended up trapped behind enemy lines in what became known as the Lost Battalion. They were surrounded, running out of food, and their own artillery started hitting them because no one knew where they were. Radios were useless, runners kept getting killed, and pigeons were the last option. The first bird was shot down, then the second. Finally, they released Cher Ami. He was hit in the chest, lost an eye, and had most of his leg blown off during the flight. Yet somehow he made it. He flew 25 miles through the chaos and delivered a message that basically said, "We're here, stop shelling us." Minutes later, the friendly fire stopped, and 197 men were saved. The army treated him like a hero. Medics patched him up. He was awarded medals, and when he died, his body went to the Smithsonian. A DNA test in 2021 finally confirmed he was a male, which fixed decades of mix-ups, though it didn't change much for a half-blind bird with a wooden leg. In a war with tanks, planes, and chemical weapons, the best way to tell your own men to stop shooting at you was to toss a pigeon into the sky and hope it made it. Things turned out all right for Cher Ami, but thousands of others weren't so lucky. They were shot, ripped apart, or vanished mid-flight, their messages never reaching anyone. Forced deportations in the Ottoman Empire. The Armenian genocide didn't happen in secret, and the people responsible didn't even bother hiding it behind the fog of war. It was carried out in broad daylight, through official channels, by a government that didn't just want Armenians relocated, they wanted them erased. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire started rounding up Armenian leaders, politicians, clergy, academics, basically anyone who could hold a community together. Most were executed early on, and the rest of the population was pushed out in massive forced deportations. That word makes it sound like they were putting people on trains, but they weren't. Instead, they marched civilians, including kids and the elderly, across deserts with no food, no water, and no shelter. The conditions were intentionally set up so very few could possibly make it out alive. A paramilitary group called the Special Organization, made up largely of violent criminals the state had let out of prison, was sent along to escort the Armenians. Their job was to follow the marches and finish what starvation and exhaustion couldn't. Whole villages were wiped out. They defiled women in public to spread fear, and children were taken and never seen again. Some of the convoys were attacked by staged tribal raids, but most of the violence came from the escorts who were supposed to be guarding them. The orders came from the top and were passed down through official memos, then carried out by local authorities and civilians who got the message loud and clear. By the time it ended, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million Armenians were dead. Even the lowest estimates still point to mass extermination, and the impact didn't stop there. Raphael Lemkin, the man who later coined the word genocide, said a major reason he pushed for a law to protect entire groups was because he had read about what happened to the Armenians as a boy. Suicide trenches, network of tunnels. Trench warfare didn't start with World War I, but that's where it became a nightmare. By late 1914, both sides had carved out a maze of ditches from the Swiss border to the North Sea. They were built to protect soldiers from bullets and shells, but they ended up trapping them in something far worse. The trenches were narrow, wet, and filled with rats and lice. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there were often pieces of dismembered corpses scattered in the mix. The floors never dried out, so soldiers' feet rotted until the skin sloughed off. Sometimes the infection spread so badly the only option was to saw the foot off on the spot. Then came the waiting. Weeks of crouching in filth, listening to artillery, knowing the next whistle could mean sprinting into machine gun fire. Men drowned in flooded shell holes, bled out tangled in barbed wire, or sat in silence after watching their friends vanish in an instant. Some broke completely. Others quietly pulled the trigger on their own boot, because a hospital bed seemed safer than another hour in the mud. In the end, the trenches killed in slow motion. And the cruel part was that for many soldiers, dying wasn't the unthinkable part. Surviving in the trenches was. Aerial reconnaissance. Eyes in the sky. At the start of World War I, aerial reconnaissance looked almost silly. You had pilots in shaky little planes trying to sketch maps by hand while bullets flew past them. By the end of the war, though, that same job had become one of the deadliest roles around. Those pilots weren't there to fly. Their orders were simple. Fly over enemy lines, take photographs, and try to make it back in one piece. That was harder than it sounds when your plane was built from wood and canvas and you didn't even get a parachute. If you were hit, you either burned or crashed. And since most of them didn't have weapons at first, they were basically floating targets with cameras. When military started strapping cameras to the planes, things got serious. Pilots were told to photograph the same stretch of land every single day from the same angle, because even the smallest change, like a trench filling with soldiers or a patch of earth being dug out, could mean an attack was on the way. And yes, artillery teams sometimes used the photos to decide what spots to hit. By the later years of the war, both sides were taking pictures of the front lines twice a day. One clear photo of a field or a tree line could determine whether thousands of soldiers kept breathing or got wiped out in a bombardment. The pilots didn't fire weapons, but their cameras pointed them. Isonzo front's terrible snow. The Italian front in World War I was basically a horror movie set on cliffs. Soldiers fought on vertical cliffs, across icy rivers, and through snowstorms, all while being ordered to charge uphill into machine gun fire. Italy had joined the war in 1915 after the Allies promised them land that wasn't theirs to begin with. Their top general, Luigi Cadorna, believed the only way forward was straight ahead. He sent wave after wave of poorly equipped men into open ground against barbed wire, snipers, and artillery. It didn't matter if the terrain was solid rock or if men froze in the snow. Cadorna kept pushing them, convinced that enough bodies would eventually break Austria's lines. In the heat of war, soldiers dug trenches into stone with their bare hands, slipped to their deaths off icy cliffs, or starved in the thin mountain air. Mudslides and avalanche swallowed men whole. Frostbite and dysentery were as deadly as enemy fire, and most assaults ended the same way. Thousands dead, and the front unmoved. It all collapsed at Caporetto, the 12th and worst battle. In just 3 weeks, the Italian army broke apart. They lost 10,000 men, 30,000 more were wounded, and around 270,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. Entire units deserted or just collapsed from hunger, illness, and sheer exhaustion. By the time the smoke cleared, Italy had lost around 300,000 men, while Austria-Hungary lost another 200,000. And for what? They didn't capture any major cities or ports. They also didn't secure any meaningful advantage. They've just left behind a lot of frozen corpses buried in mountain snow. Tier 5. Arab Revolt and Lawrence's Guerrilla Warfare. The Arab Revolt kicked off in 1916, mostly because Britain figured turning the Ottoman Empire's Arab subjects against them would be cheaper and less bloody than sending more British troops into the Mesopotamian meat grinder. So instead of boots, they sent promises, independence, new borders, maybe even the flag. What the Arabs actually got was T.E. Lawrence, a British officer with a knack for languages, a background in archaeology, and a real enthusiasm for blowing things up. Lawrence embedded himself with Sharif Hussein's forces as a liaison, but that title barely scratched the surface. He was out in the desert planning ambushes like a full-time job. One week it was dynamite strapped to camels. The next it was telegraph lines vanishing overnight. And the week after that, an Ottoman outpost would be wiped off the map before anyone could figure out what happened. Sometimes they took prisoners. Sometimes they didn't bother. Their favorite playground was the Hejaz Railway, the main supply line for Ottoman forces in the region. Lawrence and his men made it their personal mission to make that railway useless. They planted hundreds of mines along the tracks, blew up troop transports, looted whatever survived the explosion, and disappeared before the Ottomans could send backup. And they did it over and over again. Survivors, if there were any, were often left to crawl back through the sand with just enough strength to warn their commanders. What made the whole thing so effective wasn't just the destruction, it was the psychological warfare. The Ottomans had more soldiers and better equipment, but Lawrence and the Arab fighters turned the landscape itself into an enemy. Every rock, every stretch of railway, and every farmer with a donkey became a threat. Ottoman soldiers started to feel like they were being hunted by ghosts, and the fear did more damage than explosives ever could. After the war, none of the promises Britain made to the Arabs were kept. Instead of independence, the land was sliced up into mandates by Britain and France. Lawrence went home and wrote 7 Pillars of Wisdom. The Arab world got new borders, puppet governments, and colonial cops. The guerrilla war ended, but the mess it left behind, that stuck around. Live burial at Beaumont-Hamel. Beaumont-Hamel was one of the toughest German strongholds on the Somme front. When the British attacked it on July 1, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, they were feeling pretty confident. After all, they just spent an entire week hammering it with over 1 million artillery shells. The ground shook non-stop, and the higher-ups were convinced nothing could have survived. Boy, were they wrong. The Germans had dug deep bunkers, and most of those shells didn't even touch them. So when British troops were told to go over the top, many of them walked in neat lines, expecting to just mop up whatever was left. Instead, they were met with machine gun fire almost instantly. Within hours, 20,000 men were dead, entire battalions disappeared, and those who staggered into no man's land were left stranded, bleeding in the open. Some never even got that far. And then there were the ones who never came up at all. British engineers had tunneled under German lines and packed the Hawthorne Ridge mine with 40,000 pounds of ammonal. It went off at 7:20 a.m., 10 minutes before the infantry attack. The blast tore a crater into the earth and buried everyone nearby alive. That meant German troops on the surface, and even some British tunnelers who were still down there doing last-minute checks. Some bodies were blown apart instantly, but others were trapped alive in collapsed tunnels, still breathing as the dirt sealed them in. There wasn't anything to do. You just waited until your body gave out. Canadian soldiers executed for cowardice. During World War I, 25 Canadian soldiers were executed by firing squad. Officially, they were killed for cowardice or desertion. Unofficially, they were shot because the system couldn't tell the difference between trauma and treason. Canada was under British military law at the time, and that law didn't believe in shell shock. If a man froze during combat, wandered off, or refused one more suicidal charge, it didn't matter why. He could be hauled in front of a court-martial and condemned before breakfast. Men like William Alexander, Frederick Arnold, Harold Carter, and Edward Fairbairn were dragged out at dawn, shot, and buried without honors. Families were told, but usually with a watered-down excuse. And while the army called it discipline, the timing gave it away. Executions were lined up with big offensives. The higher-ups did this to remind the rest of the unit what happened if you lost your nerve. Long story short, they were killing soldiers to boost morale. Over 200 Canadians were sentenced to death, but only 25 were actually executed. The rest got prison or hard labor, which shows that the people in charge were more interested in making examples than anything else. 2 of the executed soldiers were shot for murder and were never pardoned, but the rest were officially cleared in 2006, 90 years later. The war broke them, then blamed them for being broken. Now, their names sit in the Canadian Book of Remembrance, written down like that makes up for it. The Halifax Explosion. On the morning of December 6, 1917, 2 ships collided in Halifax Harbor. One of them, the Mont Blanc, was a French cargo ship loaded with explosives, 2,925 tons of it. We're talking picric acid, TNT, gun cotton, and barrels of benzol stacked right on the deck. It was basically a floating bomb, and everyone on board knew it, but the people of Halifax didn't, because no one told them. The collision happened when the Mont Blanc crossed paths with the Emo, a Norwegian relief ship. Sparks flew, the benzol caught fire, and for the next 20 minutes, the burning ship drifted towards shore. Instead of evacuating, locals came down to the waterfront to watch the fire. No one warned them about what was coming until it was too late. The explosion wiped out everything within half a mile, and entire buildings were reduced to splinters. A chunk of the ship's anchor was launched over 4 kilometers inland, while a cannon landed on a hill 3.5 kilometers away. The pressure wave from the blast shattered windows across the city. Then came a tsunami, and after that, the fires started. Over 1,600 people died instantly. Thousands more were crushed, burned, or blinded. Many of them kids who'd been watching the fire through glass windows that shattered in their faces. Hospitals were so overwhelmed that they started lining up the bodies in hallways. And just when things couldn't get any worse, a blizzard rolled in on day 2. The Halifax Explosion still stands as the largest human-made blast before the nuclear age. It wasn't sabotage, and it wasn't a bombing. It wasn't even enemy action. It was just a perfect storm of bad timing, miscommunication, and the ship full of munitions drifting into a civilian harbor with nobody waving a red flag. Afterward, blame was tossed around, and a few court cases popped up, but were quietly dropped. Officials called it negligence, or just an accident. Either way, thousands of people died in a war they weren't even fighting, because no one thought to say, hey, maybe clear the harbor. Tier 6. Allied Blockade Famine in Germany. Not every weapon in World War I came with a trigger. Some just needed a navy and a lot of patience. From the very start of the war in 1914, the British Royal Navy set up a blockade to choke Germany's supply lines. They didn't just target weapons, they blocked food, fertilizer, fuel, and medicine. If it came by sea and could possibly support the German war effort, it was cut off. When the war ended in 1918, the blockade didn't. Britain and France kept it going well into 1919. Not because of any active threat, but because starving civilians made for good leverage during the Treaty of Versailles. So while diplomats argued over borders, Germany's population kept shrinking. Just not from combat. When the war first began, Germany already struggled to feed itself. But without imported fertilizer, farms tanked, crops failed, bread got thinner, and turnips became the main food, when they were available at all. By 1916, hunger had turned into disease. People developed rickets, scurvy, and tuberculosis, and thousands of children went blind from vitamin A deficiency. The winter of 1916 to 17 was called the Turnip Winter, because that's all anyone ate, if they were lucky. The death toll from starvation and malnutrition-related illness is still debated, but historians estimated that between 400,000 and 800,000 civilians died. Germany begged for food aid, and the Allies refused unless there were political concessions. When the food was finally allowed in, it was used as leverage. There wasn't anything technically illegal about it, since blockades were accepted under international law. It was one thing to starve an army, but going after an entire civilian population, that's something else entirely. Some British officials raised concerns, yet most were ignored, and the blockade rolled on until mid-1919. After the war, Germans didn't just remember the trenches or the treaty. They remembered watching their families waste away while full Allied ships floated just out of reach. When the Nazis came to power years later, they didn't rally people by talking about military losses alone. They also talked about the hunger. So if you really think about it, the blockade worked. It helped win the war, but it also made sure the peace didn't last. British Q-ships ambush tactic. The year is 1915, and you're a German U-boat captain hunting merchant ships. You surface next to one that looks like a perfect target. It's slow, alone, and unarmed. You figure you'll save a torpedo and just use the deck gun. The crew looks terrified. A few guys even scramble into lifeboats, and it all feels too easy. Then, the ship cracks open. Panels fall away. Fake walls collapse. And out come hidden naval guns pointing directly at your face. Congratulations, you've just been Q-shipped. Q-ship were warships disguised as helpless merchant vessels. The British rigged them with false hulls, collapsible decks, and even staged engine trouble or set small fires to really sell the illusion. When a U-boat got close enough, the crew would suddenly hoist the Royal Navy flag and blast it out of the water. Sometimes things could get ugly. For example, HMS Baralong didn't stop at sinking U-27. It executed surviving German sailors in the water and even shot more aboard a nearby vessel. Britain denied it, but the evidence says otherwise. On the opposite end of the spectrum was Inverlion, a fishing smack with sails and a single hidden cannon. Somehow it still managed to sink UB-4, turning what looked like a barn into a submarine killer. The problem though is that this technique barely worked. The British deployed nearly 200 Q-ships, and fewer than 15 ever scored a confirmed kill. Most of those happened in a short window in 1915 before German captains figured out the trick. By 1917, U-boats stayed submerged and just torpedoed everything. No questions asked. That was the end of the Q-ship experiment. They were expensive, dangerous, and after the first year, completely useless. The idea got dusted off briefly in World War II, but subs had gotten smarter, and this time the trap failed almost immediately. French Army mutinies. In the spring of 1917, General Nivelle stood in front of the French army and promised them a decisive victory within 48 hours. And honestly, the soldiers bought it. They were exhausted and half broken, but they still believed, maybe, just maybe, this time it'd be different. It wasn't. The offensive at Chemin des Dames completely fell apart, and thousands of men died in a matter of weeks. That's when the army snapped, but not in the way you'd expect. This wasn't some chaotic rebellion. Nobody shot their officers or ran to the Germans. Instead, they stayed put. They manned their trenches. They followed orders, except the ones that involved charging into barbed wire and machine guns for the 5th time that month. By June, nearly half of the entire French army had joined in, about 49 divisions. Some groups staged protest parades while others occupied towns and demanded better rations. But what most of them wanted was simple: rest, home leave, actual food, and a guarantee they wouldn't be sent to die in another hopeless push. At the same time, rumors and pamphlets were spreading across the ranks. Some soldiers had started reading about what happened in Russia, the mutinies, the revolution, the way soldiers there just stopped playing along. And since the Americans hadn't shown up yet, there was this growing feeling that they'd been abandoned. The men made up their minds that the real enemy wasn't in the German trenches. It was in the French headquarters, giving the same bad orders over and over again. That's when General Pétain took over. He understood that morale was wrecked, so he backed off the suicidal offensives, increased leave, rotated troops more often, and tried to act like a human being. And for the most part, it worked. The army pulled itself back together, though it wasn't exactly out of goodwill, because while Pétain gave with one hand, he punished with the other. Around 3,400 soldiers were court-martialed. About 550 were sentenced to death, but only 26 of those executions were officially confirmed, and the numbers beyond that get fuzzy. The French high command kept things quiet, since they didn't want Germany or the public to know how bad things had gotten. And somehow that worked too. The Germans never realized that nearly half the French army had basically gone on strike. That might be the most impressive part. The biggest coordinated military mutiny in Western history happened right in the middle of World War I, and barely anyone noticed. Treaty of Versailles Retribution. The First World War ended in 1918, but the punishment for it began in 1919. On June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after Franz Ferdinand was shot, Allied leaders gathered in a mirrored room at the Palace of Versailles to sign what they called a peace treaty. No matter what they said, the truth is it read like a checklist of humiliation, with Germany as the only box to tick. First on the list was blame. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for starting the war. Even at the time, plenty of people thought it was excessive, but the Allies framed it as justice. Next came the bill. Reparations were set at billions, with Germany expected to hand over cash, coal, timber, and whatever else could be squeezed out. When they fell behind on payments, the Allies marched into the Ruhr in 1923 and started hauling resources out themselves. German workers answered with strikes. The government printed money to keep them afloat, and the result was hyperinflation so bad, people used banknotes as firewood. Then came disarmament. The treaty ordered Germany to dismantle most of its military. That meant no tanks, no heavy artillery, and no real air force. Germany decided they weren't going to become sitting ducks just because the treaty demanded it, so they got creative. They trained pilots in the Soviet Union, built weapons in Sweden, and hid tanks and artillery in factories. By the time Hitler rearmed openly in the 1930s, the groundwork had already been done. Finally, the justice box. Germany was told to hand over war criminals, including the Kaiser, who never saw a courtroom and instead retired comfortably in the Netherlands. Out of nearly 900 names submitted for trial, Germany put only 12 men in front of a judge. Most walked free, and one was welcomed home with flowers. The Allies complained, but that was about it. The checklist was supposed to end a war, but it just lit the fuse for the next one. Germany didn't finish paying off the Versailles debt until 2010, long after the treaty's real damage had already been done. When the war finally ended, about 20 million people were dead. Entire towns were wiped off the map, and some soldiers never came back. The ones who did weren't right anymore. Some didn't talk, some couldn't sleep, and some never really stopped fighting. And if you asked who won, no one could give you a straight answer, because nobody really did. The war didn't fix anything. Instead, the world came out of it a little more cracked than it went in. That's all we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.